So today we're going to continue lectures on arboviruses. Okay, so this is a second lecture in virology topics, and this lecture is kind of like last lecture was on viruses, essentially like here's the basic biology and general sort of themes in viruses. This lecture is kind of like here are the top 10 arboviruses, like you want to know like what they are, you want to have heard of them before. Now again, like a scientist may spend like his or her entire life studying any one of these in particular. So there's a lot of stuff that's not going to be said, but I think it's important for me to introduce these specific viruses so that you've heard of them before. So it's kind of like a top 10 hits lecture type thing. To start, in arboviruses, there's sort of like a category of encephalitis. So encephalitis is a pathology where certain viruses infect the central nervous system, so the CNS. And if you haven't had physiology, human physiology or vertebrate physiology, vertebrates have sort of like two different nervous systems. So there's a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and the brainstem, or the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is essentially like the sensory neurons that take in signals and send it to the central nervous system for processing. And so it's called CNS or the PNS. And the PNS is responsible for controlling things that kind of like come automatically. So like programmed responses, like when the doctor hits your knee and you all of a sudden like shoot your leg forward, that's the peripheral nervous system. Walking, like the act of walking becomes essentially like peripheral nervous system. So the very, very like programmed things that you can sort of like put on in the background. Whereas the central nervous system is for like everything with it, like advanced cognition, like thinking, planning, memory, things like that. So back to the viruses, it's important to know that many of these arboviruses that we care about are encephalitides, and so they cause encephalitis, which is invasion and replication in the central nervous system. So what would you imagine would be some of the pathologies of viruses that infect the CNS, knowing that the CNS is responsible for like complex mental behavior? What would be some like pathologies? Yeah, you can get like brain damage. So like this is why people are very afraid of these arboviruses, like West Nile virus is one, for example, because if you get to the point where it invades your brain, it can cause lasting, like for the rest of your life, can cause brain damage. And you can have what are called sequelae, which is essentially like permanent conditions resulting from a previous like pathology. So you could get West Nile virus and you might get over it, but you might live the rest of your life with some brain damage. That's why people are, I guess, I don't know if I want to say afraid, but that's why people are sort of think these viruses are some serious things. Nice to see you. Okay, now there's also, so one sort of grouping is the encephalitis viruses. Another sort of grouping are the hemorrhagic fevers. So like dengue and yellow fever, those are hemorrhagic fevers. And those are sort of different in a sense that they're not really infecting your brain. They're infecting your internal organs and your vascular tissues, and they cause vascular damage. And like I said, I've said this before, they kind of like melt your internal organs and you essentially just bleed out into your body. They sort of like disintegrate your insides, causing hemorrhaging, which is literally like the escape of blood. And then after so much blood escapes, you have systemic problems, like your respiratory action fails because your blood is circulating, the function of it is to circulate oxygen and stuff like that. And if you have so much hemorrhage that it's hemorrhaging into your body is then not breathing properly. Your tissues are not getting the proper nutrients, and so you can die from hemorrhagic fevers through those phenotypes. Okay, one important thing, just again, before we go into sort of the specific viruses, that is a common theme with these viruses is that different strains can be better or worse. So for instance, this is very prevalent in like dengue. So dengue has 4, it might be 5 now, but at least 4 different strains. So there's dengue 1, 2, 3, 4. And I feel like I'm always saying this, but what's the definition of a strain? We know this, right? Did I say that last class? Yeah, a strain means it's the same sort of like thing, it's the same sort of like object, but its genotype is different. It's acquired some different alleles or some different mutations or some different evolutions. And so there's different viruses, and viruses evolve very quickly. Why would dengue evolve quickly? Review. Why is it, what's mechanistically, why does it mutate fast? It's a single-stranded RNA virus. There's no template to repair off of. So they mutate very fast. They form different strains. And these different strains can have different effects on people. Okay, and you see this also with plants, like different strains can be better or worse, okay, depending on the sequence. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that there's different strains of these viruses and there's a lot of variability. So where these viruses pop up, this medical veterinary entomology is kind of like, I guess, also synonymous with tropical medicine. And that's because many of the viruses that we study and that we care about overlap with the distribution of Aedes aegypti, which is tropical. So most of these flaviviruses are also tropical, and they overlap, their distributions overlap with the presence of the vector that spreads them. Okay, and we've kind of talked about that in the past. Okay, so with that said, top 10 arboviruses you should know by name. Oh, and this was a correction from a quick correction before we go into the top 10. The Bunioviruses, last lecture, I say that the Bunioviruses always have 3 segments of their genome. There's some Bunioviruses, there's been a reclassification, and there are some Bunioviruses that have disegmented genomes. I don't know why I put this slide here, but that's a correction. Okay, now back to the top 10. Okay, these are honorable mentions, not in the top 10. So there's this virus called the Myorovirus, and you want to remember these, like, what do you call them, like acronyms? The viruses all have their names, and then they all have sort of like an acronym name. You kind of want to know the acronym names because when people write about them in papers, you'll see the acronyms. Okay, so there's Myorovirus, it's a topovirus. Reservoir, for each of these viruses, I'll kind of talk about, okay, what's its family, what's its reservoir. It's monkeys. Some of these are not completely known, because some of these, like Myorovirus, it's like a disease that we know about from kind of like walking around, tromping around in the jungle, but it's not famous for coming out and infecting humans in an urban cycle a lot. So some of these we're still kind of like learning about, but the location is humid forests in tropical South America. Okay, so that's honorable mention. This one, you might hear about this someday. Another honorable mention, tick-borne encephalitis, TBE. Okay, this is a flavivirus. So again, many flaviviruses. Reservoir, birds, rodents. Most of these diseases are not well, the pathology, 1 to 2% mortality. That's pretty bad. The vector is Ixodes ticks. Wait for that point that I was just about to make for the next slide. Okay, now let's get into the real ones. Okay, so this one is number 10. Japanese encephalitis. Many of these are veterinary viruses. Not so many of the viruses jump and can also infect humans. Okay, so this one is famous for, it can infect pigs and horses. Many of these arboviruses kill horses with high fatality rates. So the Eastern equine encephalitis. I can't remember the mortality rate on that one, but it'll come up. Many of these kill horses at high rates. And so veterinarians, these are potentially very important for veterinarians. And some of these do cross jump. So this one crosses from humans. Humans can get this with a high fatality rate. And again, because many of these are not well studied, we don't really have completely good vaccines for all of these. This one, apparently we do. Vector is Culex. Okay. Next. Rift Valley fever. Okay, this is a Buniovirus. Amplifying host reservoir is bats. This one is famous for killing lambs. The vector is Culex in 80s, location Africa, and there is an approved animal vaccine. This is the one I was talking about. Eastern equine encephalitis. This one kills horses at 90%. 90%. So like if you were in Kentucky, you would really worry about this. If you're like a horse breeder, you would for sure worry about mosquitoes being around your horses, because if they get this, they can die at 90% ratio. It produces blindness, anorexia in horses. The vectors are Aedes, Aclerotatus. Okay, but there is an effective horse vaccine. That's number 8. Lacrosse encephalitis. Okay, so again, you're seeing lots of encephalitis. So Eastern equine encephalitis, Lacrosse encephalitis, Japanese encephalitis. These are all encephalitides, so they infect the central nervous system. This one's a Buniovirus. I actually knew somebody who got Lacrosse encephalitis, and she had brain damage. So again, the weird thing about these diseases is if you, let's do like a funnel. So let's have like a funnel, and let's imagine a scenario where like 100 people get something like Japanese encephalitis virus. Most people who get these, their bodies, their immune systems are able to fight it off. So it's usually only like a tiny subset of people who actually get these that have come through the funnel and have like end up with like brain damage. So there's probably actually like more incidence, higher incidence of these viruses in the population. Like people are actually getting them more than you would think. But in 99% of the cases, it doesn't really cause problems. And so you don't even see it. You don't even know that it's there. And it's like in the 1% cases where it's extremely bad. That's kind of like how we identify them. So they're probably underreported for sure. And probably more people than you would think of get these, but they just don't cause bad problems with a high probability. Okay, now we're starting to get to the ones that you've heard of. Chikungunya. Okay, so this one is vectored by mosquitoes, Aedes. They all kind of look like these. This one is worldwide. Here's the chikungunya distribution. Again, like, okay, so what do I say about these? Now that we've kind of like learned about viruses, we should be able to interpret like figures like this. So for instance, here's a figure that's showing you Topoviruses and Flavioviruses. And we're looking at a picture and you see 5', 3'. So we're looking at obviously what is the genome of these viruses, okay? And it shows you now something we should be able to understand, the difference in structures between Topoviruses and Flavioviruses. Topoviruses start their genome with these non-structural proteins and end in structural proteins, okay? Flavioviruses have structural proteins first and then non-structural proteins. So many of these viruses, kind of related to the flavies, all the ones that are single-stranded RNA, they might be just slightly different in a sense of how they're organizing their genome, what comes first, what comes second, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, West Nile virus. Again, looks similar. What does this one look like? This virus particle looks exactly like Zika. Here's the Zika particle, and here's the Here's the West Nile virus particle. So you can actually see like the families of these viruses, like they have similar structures. And again, it's just sort of a subtle difference in the alleles that causes things to be much worse or not so bad for human pathologies. West Nile virus is famous for its reservoir as birds. So I think like crows, oftentimes to find its prevalence, you'll go and you'll test crows and things like that to see if it's in a population. And so the culex will bite the birds, pick it up, and then if they bite a human, they might transmit it. This is the famous one where it's only 1 of 100 that has neurological invasion. So this is also an encephalitis, but it's only 1% that get that. Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. Okay, another one. Buniovirus. What's unique about this one? Oh, this one is spread by ticks. Okay, so this one is a famous because this is probably the worst tick-borne virus. So people who study tick-borne viruses, this is probably what they're working on. Another hemorrhagic fever. So again, you're seeing sort of like a dichotomy, and some of these are hemorrhagic fevers, some of these are encephalitis. No vaccine. Don't get. So hemorrhagic fever in humans or just this one's in humans. Once we're below number 5, well, humans get chikungunya. Humans get West Nile. Humans can get Lacrosse. Humans can get Eastern Equine. Humans can get Rift Valley. Humans can get all these in the number 10. That's why they're in the top 10. But the top 5 to 10 are mostly animals. But Crimean Congo is, I think, monkeys. Now we're starting to get into the section where they're mostly monkeys and human viruses. No more horse viruses after number 5. Zika. Okay, it doesn't look like this. There's been some error. What's famous about the Zika virus? Yeah, so microcephaly. That's one thing that's very famous about the Zika virus, is that it can cause microcephaly in developing human fetuses. What else is famous about Zika virus? Yeah, it's sexually transmitted. So this is one reason why we're kind of like really worried about it, because it's got this like dual combination of it's sexually transmitted. So you can imagine you go to Mexico for your honeymoon or spring break, whatever, and you get into a situation where you're doing one of these things and you also might get bit, and you have also gotten bit by a mosquito. If you're in an endemic region, you pick up Zika and you get somebody pregnant, and then who knows, maybe they get microcephaly. So like we worry about that for these 2 reasons, because they kind of like go hand in hand. But if you're just sort of like a normal person and you get Zika, you're not pregnant, it's really not that big of a deal. But if you get it and you are pregnant, then you have this chance that you have the microcephaly. And the microcephaly sort of like appeared, like we never associated it with Zika before, until like there was a huge outbreak in Brazil. And then that's when the doctors sort of like made the link between microcephaly and Zika. So Zika is actually a very old virus. It's been around for a while. So it was first documented in 1947 in monkeys in Uganda in the Zika forest. So a common pattern of viruses is they're named after where they usually originate from. That is a common pattern. And you can see how Zika has spread over the years. So in the 1947, it was first documented. Second time it was documented in 1960 in Nigeria. And then you started seeing it spread throughout the whole world. So in the 1970s, there were cases in Pakistan, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and now it's spreading over. You can see how it's It's sort of coming out of Africa and spreading throughout the world. And then in 2007, there was an epidemic in Micronesia. Somehow it made it like across the ocean. 2013, Pacific Ocean, ended up in French Polynesia. And then the very, very famous outbreak for us was the most recent outbreak, 2014, 2016, where it was a big outbreak in Brazil and spreading throughout the Americas. And that's when they made the link between the microcephaly and the Zika virus. So here's an interesting question. Does the color, so like as you've seen the spread of Zika virus, and you note a very, very common pattern in vector biology is like all of a sudden these viruses like pop up and then people care about them for like a year and then they just kind of like disappear. So from what you've seen on this map, do you think that like Zika will just be like short-lived, or what do you think? Yeah, it's going to be it. So there might be short-lived like outbreaks, but it seems like it's here to stay. Like it's been here for 60, 70 years now.
It might also just be more cases than not because that people haven't actually
detected it yet. That's true. Like
in line with the travel, like in the old times, people wouldn't travel much as in today's time.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a problem. Is people travel way more now than we used to. And that, as we've learned with the malaria, that is one of the major causes of outbreaks is when just people are just traveling. They're moving the things that are inside of them, the holobiont. Monkeys. Let me check that. This says unknown. I think we're pretty sure it floats around in monkeys. I should check on that because these slides are probably out of date now. I would imagine we would know this by now. My guess is that it's monkeys. Most of these flavies float around in monkeys and humans.
So the kind of like viruses, the virus like aspect, because like it's not just something that affects just one disease, it affects like
Everywhere.
In like different extremes.
Yes. Well, I mean, vector biology affects everywhere. It's not just viruses, but you could say like, yeah, like malaria. It's really only, well, malaria is actually almost like worldwide. But many of, I'm trying to think of if I agree with that point or not. For sure, like people in America get West Nile virus, like we get viruses, but we also get other diseases. But I see what you're saying in a sense that some diseases are essentially controlled by like socioeconomic status. Like if you are living in a house, we talked about this before, like if you're living in a house with windows and a roof, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get bit all night long and get malaria. But yes, everybody's subject to viruses. Although not necessarily this one anymore. Yellow fever. Okay, so yellow fever is number 2 because it's really, really bad, but we have an effective vaccine. And the incidence of yellow fever has gone significantly down because there is an effective vaccine. But yellow fever is considered kind of like the worst flavivirus. It has a high kill rate. And it was a big deal in the early 1900s. So in the early 1900s, there are famous yellow fever outbreaks in like Boston and what do you call it, the East Coast. And it just like malaria, it was originally not in the New World, but it came over on Aedes aegypti from the boats, and it was here until we sort of like got rid of many of the diseases in North America. But its distribution nowadays, here's its distribution nowadays. It's still in South America, still in Africa. It's still, yellow fever is still there for sure. And we still have the vector for sure. Oh, that's interesting that you say that. That's actually the next slide. Is it's been a mystery of yellow fever. Is it doesn't seem to go to Asia. It just doesn't seem to be there. I don't know why. I don't know the reason for that. But that's sort of like a weird mystery about yellow fever. Is why was it never in Asia? I don't know. It could have something to do with the mosquitoes. Who knows? Dengue fever. Okay, and this is what we'll read the next paper about. Dengue fever is kind of like, it's the worst flavivirus. It kills the most people, and we have no real effective vaccine for it. So dengue fever is kind of like the worst arbovirus out there right now. So you should really know what it is. It's called, the colloquial name for it is breakbone fever. It infects your joints and causes pain in your joints. It feels, supposedly, I've never had it, but I've known people who have had it, and they say it does feel like that. It feels like your bones are breaking. And there's three different forms of dengue. There's dengue fever, which is not like, you're not going to die if you just get dengue. Dengue fever is like, you get it and you'll feel like hell. You'll feel like your bones are breaking for like 6 days, and then you'll get over it. The first infection with dengue is not what people worry about. Okay. But then there's subsequent forms, which are much more serious. So there's dengue hemorrhagic fever. And this occurs uniquely with dengue through a unique mechanism. Okay, so actually I have a slide for this. If you look at dengue, here are the 4 serotypes of dengue in 1970. Okay, in Africa there were 1 and 2, in Caribbean 1 and 2, in Asia there were 1 through 4, and today all the different strains, 1 to 4, are everywhere throughout the entire world. So why is this relevant? Why is this important? Because dengue hemorrhagic fever, I can't type. This is the hemorrhagic fever. What happens is you first get infected with dengue, any serotype. Let's say dengue X, could be 1 through 4. Okay, you get the disease, you have it for 6 days. It's terrible, you get over it. Okay, it's when you then travel around and you get a different serotype. So then you get a second infection later in life. First one's not so bad. Let's say then you get a second dengue infection. Get bit by a different mosquito, a different time, and a different strain. This time it's dengue X2, different strain. Now you can get dengue hemorrhagic fever. Okay, this is where your body goes through this unique process called antibody dependent enhancement. And this has to do with immunology. So let me describe this, and then once I describe this, you'll understand dengue hemorrhagic fever. Okay. When you get infected with a virus, your white blood cells recognize that virus how? What do your white blood cells use to recognize viruses? Antibodies. A protein, antibodies. So when you get infected with a virus, let's say this is a virus in your body, it has antigens on its surface. These are like those glycosylated proteins. Those are antigens. Your body sees these and it says, this is not normal. This is not something I normally see in the blood. And your body can synthesize antibodies, which look like this, to those surface proteins. And the antibodies then in your blood bind to those viral particles, those virions, and then attract the white blood cells, which then swallow essentially these virus particles and phagocytose them, like eat them. Okay, that's how your body fights off infections. You have these antibodies that get produced to match and recognize the virus. They bind to it. They attract white blood cells that will then destroy that encased virions. Okay. What happens in antibody-dependent enhancement is dengue has a unique trick in that dengue can infect the white blood cells. I think it's the leukocytes. Did I say that somewhere? I'm pretty sure it's the leukocytes. Dengue can infect these white blood cells. Okay, so the first time you get dengue, what happens is this: is your body produces antibodies that match that virus. Your body fights it off. Second time you get dengue, okay, you still have these antibodies floating around in your system for the old infection. And if you get a new infection, the antibodies will recognize the new infection, but they won't be as effective at killing it. So then what happens is, now what you have is you have a virus particle with a receptor or antibody that's drawing in white blood cells that the virus can now infect, and the white blood cell is not capable of killing this different strain. So what happens is you now essentially are bringing hosts to the virus. Your body is like shipping white blood cells to the virus, okay? And then that virus, that second virus, just replicates in those white blood cells. And so you get this is called antibody dependent enhancement. So it's like the first time you get the dengue virus infection with one serotype, your body fights it off. Second time you get it, the virus is a little bit different, and your body thinks it can fight it off, but it can't. And it actually makes it worse because it sends the white blood cells, and then the dengue infects those white blood cells. Okay, so B cell, I don't know enough about immunology to say it infects B cells. I don't know. Is that a specific type of? Somebody Google, let's Google that. Dengue infect B cells. Yes, it seems like it does. Let's also define the leukocytes while we're here. The type of blood cell is made from the bone marrow, found in the lymph tissue, part of the body's immune system. I don't know if a leukocyte is also a B cell. It's a type of B cell. Okay. So yes, they infect the B cells. So now you can imagine, if the virus is now destroying the cells that are your only defense mechanism against the virus, now you're screwed. And that is dengue hemorrhagic fever. And then if you essentially get to the last throes of dengue hemorrhagic fever, you go into what's called dengue shock syndrome, which is the third version of dengue. And this kills people. People die from this. So it's not the first infection of dengue that's dangerous. It's the second infection with a different serotype. That's why dengue is so dangerous. That's always confused me, but it does sound like that, yeah. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So the paper that we're going to read next time that we'll discuss is about antibody-dependent enhancement. Let's see. So now you can imagine, let's ask the question now, a vaccine for dengue. What would we worry about with a vaccine for dengue? Yeah, a vaccine for dengue might actually produce antibody-dependent enhancement. It might make it worse. So you might get a vaccine. So imagine you have, as that picture showed, dengue 1 through 4 strains in your local area. And imagine you get a vaccine that was developed for dengue 1. You get that vaccine. You think you're protected now from dengue 1, which you might be. But in your area, there's also dengue 3, dengue 4, and dengue 2. And now if you get dengue 2 or dengue 3 or dengue 4, that vaccine, the purpose of the vaccine is to produce those antibodies. Now you might have just made yourself into dengue hemorrhagic fever like I don't know what you'd call it, but you've essentially shot yourself in the foot if you got that vaccine, because the vaccine would have produced the antibody dependent enhancement effects on the subsequent infections. So a vaccine for dengue has never been essentially created, because if you make a vaccine for dengue, it has to be effective against all 4 serotypes at the same time. If it's not effective against all 4 serotypes at the same time, you're going to produce this effect where you're actually like making people more likely to die from the disease from this vaccine. So this is a famous example where sorry, I was distracted. This is a famous example where if you can't develop a vaccine, what are your alternative strategies? How else might you control the disease? Kill the mosquito, exactly. So this is a, yes. This is a famous example of why in some cases, in some particular diseases, a vaccine is not always like going to be the answer. Sometimes the best answer is actually the vector control. And that's the case for dengue, which is why so many of the worldwide efforts are focused on eradicating or getting rid of Aedes aegypti, so you don't have an effective vaccine against dengue.
Getting rid of Aedes aegypti is just like evolutionary might lead to like something down the line.
Yeah, Aedes albopictus. Yes, but I still think, so you're saying like if you create a hole in nature, it's just going to be filled. Is essentially what you're saying. I kind of agree with that. But at the same time, it might not be filled for like 30,000 years. So if we could get rid of like if we could get rid of one of the humans' worst like mosquitoes for like 30,000 years, like that'd be a pretty good deal. So I feel like we should still try. But I know essentially, I know exactly what you're saying, and I agree with it, that as soon as you get rid of a species, it's just going to be filled by something else through evolution. Okay. And the last famous thing about dengue is the sort of the connection to Wolbachia, to loop us all back to Wolbachia. What's the point there? I know you know about this, Daniel. Describe it to me.
So like Wolbachia actually, some versions of Wolbachia like are basically made from mosquitoes, like
Yeah, and I know I've talked about this before, so this is a review. But if you're a mosquito and you have Wolbachia, in some cases, these Wolbachia stimulate the immune system of the mosquito. The mechanism is not completely known. And then if that mosquito takes a blood meal with dengue in it, that mosquito is more likely to fight off the dengue virus infection and less likely to spread it. It reduces, so the correct way to say this is Wolbachia can reduce vector competence for dengue.
Also, it needs to note that
And
it's
Zika.
not for all the dengue viruses. It was just for like, I think it was just one of them.
Serotype? No, I'm pretty sure it's for all 4.
I checked the literature I read was like they checked it against DNP2. That's what dengue virus.
Let's see if we can Google that. It's a really good question. Does Wolbachia block all dengue serotypes? And all dengue serotypes. That's what I thought. And I guess West Nile virus. And I know they do it. I know it does effectively block Zika as well. But there are some viruses. Here's where you're right. Is there for sure are some viruses that Wolbachia does not block, and there are some viruses that Wolbachia might actually like make worse. Like it's not the Wolbachia inhibition of virus thing is not like a global constant that Wolbachia just inhibits all these viruses. And there might be situations in some strange place where they have a different disease that's endemic. There could be a scenario where it's actually like worse. But in general, it seems to be very effective at reducing the virus is that we actually fear, like dengue. Let's end early. Any questions? So this is the last virus lecture.